This is a production of Cornell University.
Nick Vanual, I'm the director of the Einaudi Center, which is sponsoring this distinguished speaker series in foreign policy. Let me say a few words and then introduce our speaker, and we can get going. This is part of the distinguished speaker series, which the Einaudi Center started about 3 years ago, and which promotes a number of research and teaching and meeting activities, really in order to maximize the intellectual impact of the existing resources at Cornell in the broad area of international public affairs. We're very grateful for the support that we've received for this foreign policy initiative, that this is a part of, notably from the Einaudi family, and Luigi Einaudi, the former U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, whose support's been very important, and also the Kessler family, and from Judy Lund Biggs, who's just recently provided some very important support for us. Let me mention just a couple activities that the initiative is sponsoring over the course of this academic year. The next speaker in this particular series is Nancy Birdsall, who's director of the Center for Global Development in Washington and really one of the leading observers of the international development process. Martin Palus, ambassador of the Czech Republic to the U.S., will be here in the spring. We haven't set a date yet. And Angelo Pangratis, the deputy ambassador of the EU in Washington, is also speaking here later this month, and is speaking specifically to a class of undergraduates. In the second half of October, the Einaudi Center will welcome our Bartels Fellow for the year. This is Louise Arbour, who is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and who will be here on October 21st and 22nd. Let me also say we have a very exciting event on November 10. We're starting the first of a series of critical debates on foreign policy with a debate on the role of the U.S. in Iraq. This will be convened the week after the election, so hopefully there'll be a lot to talk about. For this event, we've invited Michael O'Hanlon of the Brookings Institution, Professor Juan Cole of the University of Michigan, Lakhdar Brahimi, who is the A.D. White professor, or is a A.D. White professor, and who's the ex-foreign minister of Algeria and a UN special representative to Afghanistan and Iraq. And finally, Judge Raid Jui Hamadi al-Saidi, the former chief investigative judge of the Iraqi High Tribunal, who, as many of you know, is currently at the law school. If you want to know more about any of these events, which we very much hope you'll come to, I suggest that you look at our calendar, and they should all be listed in the coming weeks. So let me introduce Stephen Krasner, our speaker today. He is a Cornell alumni from the class of 1963, so we're welcoming him back. He is currently the Graham Stewart Professor of International Relations at Stanford University, where he holds a number of other appointments. From February 2005 to April 2007, he was the director of the policy planning at the State Department in Washington, where he worked on a number of issues, including foreign assistance reform and energy policy. In 2002, he served as the director for governance and development at the National Security Council. He received his BA from Cornell in 1963, a master's from Columbia in 1967, and a PhD from 1972. Before going to Stanford in 1981, he taught at Harvard and UCLA, and he was the chair of the political science department at Stanford from 1984 to 1991. Professor Krasner has written widely on the political determinants of international economic relations, on American foreign policy, and on issues of sovereignty. His major publications include Defending the National Interest, 1978, International Regimes, of which he was the editor in 1983, Structural Conflict, The Third World Against Global Liberalism, 1985, Exploration and Contestation in the Study of World Politics, which he was the editor in '99. Sovereignty, semicolon, Organized Hypocrisy, also from 1999, and Problematic Sovereignty, Contested Rules and Political Possibilities in 2001. Professor Krasner is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The title of his talk today is Can America Find a Grand Strategy? Please welcome Professor Krasner.
Thanks for that nice introduction. I was trying to think of something that would kind of connect my Cornell experience with people that are undergraduates here now. But I have to confess that my most vivid kind of visceral memories of Cornell were trying to get my girlfriend back to the dorm in early February, walking from College Town to Risley when there were still curfews for women at Cornell. And that's kind of an experience which is like totally outside of anything that you guys know about, like working on a manual typewriter. So I'm not sure quite what the right connection is. When Nick asked me to give this lecture, which was actually a year ago, I thought this was a great idea. It would be a terrific idea for me to try and think through some issues I hadn't thought through, and I actually had a long enough time to think about it. And I've done a lot of reading over the course of the last year and thought about this a lot, or thought about it is not quite the right word, kind of agonized about it, thinking, oh my God, what am I going to say? Am I going to be able to actually think about anything, develop anything coherent here? But it's to say, I think if you look at this issue of grand strategy for the United States in the post-9/11 world, this is an extremely difficult problem. I think the Bush administration actually did have a grand strategy, which I'll talk about, which hasn't worked. If you look at the presidential candidates, Obama and McCain, neither of them has articulated something that you could see as an effective grand strategy for the United States. And a grand strategy, to really work, has to do a number of different things. It has to stipulate an overall strategic objective for what American foreign policy ought to be. It has to, and in doing this, to be effective, it has to be able to provide guidance across a wide range of specific policy areas. And this is something, I would say I understand much better, having worked in government, than I did before, that if you're thinking about policy guidance, the American government is doing hundreds, even thousands of things at any particular point in time. So it's not the Secretary of State, but it's the political officer in Montevideo who has to do something in terms of working with his or her counterpart. And in those situations, you need some kind of strategic objective that can guide and give people an understanding within the bureaucracy about what overall broad foreign policy objectives are. Third, an effective grand strategy has to be able to mobilize domestic political support. If it can't do that, it won't work in the United States. Because whatever it is, an effective grand strategy will cost something. And finally, and I think in some ways this summarizes the others, it's got to be consistent with underlying structural conditions. All right, we do have, if you look at effective grand strategies in the United States, containment is the obvious classic example. There was a basic fundamental objective of containment. This was a policy developed by George Kennan, who was actually the first director of policy planning. And everybody knows that Kennan developed the containment strategy and grand strategy. And I'm asked sometimes, well, what's policy planning doing now? What's your grand strategy now? And I have to say, first of all, that Kennan actually developed the containment doctrine when he was still at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And secondly, that these strategies come along maybe once every decade, and actually we never came up with one of them when I was working in Washington. So it did have a clear basic objective, which was to contain communist expansion. It followed from that were a number of specific policies: nuclear deterrence, regional alliances, Western-based international financial institutions. So the World Bank and the IMF, the GATT, and then the World Trade Organization. A series of overt wars in Vietnam and Korea, where we didn't fight the Soviets, but we fought against Soviet communist expansion, and a set of covert interventions against real and sometimes perceived communist threats in Iran, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, Chile. You can argue about the wisdom of these policies, but there was from each of these specific actions, But in the containment doctrine, there were a set of specific policies that followed from this overall strategic objective. It did conform with the structural environment in the Cold War. So you had bipolarity. We were trying to contain the Soviet Union and communism, which we saw as its manifestation. There was anxiety in Europe and Japan, the other major parts of the world, at least some parts of those population, with communism. There was strong domestic support in the United States for anti-communist policies. And I think because communism was seen as being antithetical to basic American values, to individualism, democracy, free markets. So the idea of the House Un-American Activities Committee was actually well named. It was something that people saw as being fundamentally un-American. And in the end, of course, containment worked. The current environment is one which is, I would describe in the following way. You do have, in terms of a structural situation, a degree of U.S. dominance, hegemony, however you label it, which is historically unprecedented in the 400-year history of the modern state system. The U.S. spends as much as all other countries combined on defense, maybe more than all other countries combined. One American aircraft carrier can strike 700 targets in one day, which is probably more than any other air force in the world in total, and the United States has 12 carriers and a lot of other planes besides. The United States economy is 27% of world GDP in 2006. Patents, if you look at technology, 51% of the patents issued by the U.S. Patent Office in 2007 were to Americans, and the percentage for the period 1977 to 2007 was 55%. So it's gone down a little bit. There's still a very impressive level of American preeminence in global technology. If you look at culture, I tried to look down the list of the 100 highest grossing films worldwide. And they're Hollywood films, although many of these are Hollywood films that were directed or by guys or acted in by people who didn't originate in the United States. So American hegemony is, I think, one attribute of the current international system. Second attribute is the presence of a Western security community, also historically unprecedented. The fact that if you look at the major Western powers, war among these powers is unthinkable. This may not be true forever, but it's been true for quite a long period of time. And there isn't, I think, any indication that this Western security community is disintegrating. This may be the result of nuclear weapons because people are anxious about fighting each other, which could certainly explain why you haven't had war among any of the major powers since 1945, the longest period in history that's been the case. It may have to do with changing attitudes about war. It may have to do with the absence of territorial disputes. It may have to do with this sense of identity among democratic states. Regardless of what the underlying causes are, and there may be more than one, it is the case that war among the major Western industrial powers is right now unthinkable, and it's pretty hard to see exactly how it would happen. That's something else that's totally new at a global level. Third attribute of the contemporary environment is the existence in Europe of what you can call a postmodern world, a world which has actually transcended conventional notions of sovereignty. So if you look at the European Union, in my view, this is something also unique historically in the global system. It's not just an international organization, and it's not a federal state. And it's not going to become, I don't think, a federal state or a conventional international organization. So you have pooled sovereignty in the form of the European Court and the European Monetary Union. So you have organizations in Europe that actually dictate national policy. You have qualified majority voting in the Council of Europe on some specific issues. So a member of the European Union might object to a specific trade policy that's being pursued by the European Union. They still have to follow that policy. It's completely at variance with our conventional notions of what sovereignty means. It's unclear where the European Union is going to end up. It's still clearly a work in progress. It's unclear what the geographic scope will be. You have to say it is, though, a success which is, my guess is more than the people who thought of the European integration in the 1940s, like Robert Schuman, more than they possibly could have hoped. It's really an incredible accomplishment in this area of the world which basically committed suicide or near suicide in the first part of the 20th century, to create an integrated structure which affects now, virtually all of Europe. I went to one of the battle scenes in France, Verdun, which was the bloodiest battle in the First World War. I don't remember the figures. So, 1 million people, I think, in total on both sides were killed. And you go to this memorial, and there's the French flag and the German flag, and in between them is the EU flag. Well, it's pretty amazing and moving that Europe could have accomplished this. So I think the European Union really is an extraordinary accomplishment, something that's made a tremendous difference. I think if you look at Central Europe, it's inconceivable that Central Europe would have been integrated in the way that it has in a kind of democratic, market-oriented world absent the European Union. I do not think the European Union will be replicated. I think it's a result of, although if you look at the African Union or Mercosur, there are other regional organizations around the world which have mimicked the European Union in language and to some extent in practice. But I think the European Union was the result of, I think, really two critical events. Two critical factors. One was the fact that the United States was able to provide a security umbrella for Europe, so it took security issues off the table for the European powers themselves. That's the first issue. And I think second, and even more important, is the fact that Germany, which is the largest country in Europe, the most powerful country in Europe, wanted, after Germany's experience, I think in World War I and especially World War II, essentially to bury itself in Europe. So that rather than trying to dominate Europe or find an international organization which might expand the reach of German power, in fact, what the Germans wanted to do was constrain their own freedom of action. I do not see either of these kind of variables replicated anyplace else. I mean, if you look at Mercosur, I don't think Brazil is really interested in constraining its freedom of action in the southern, in South America. I think Mercosur is a good organization. I think they're happy to be there and they're happy to dominate the organization. If you look at even security issues, I mean, there is no equivalent to the function which and the role that the United States played and still plays in some ways in providing a security umbrella for Europe, which took these security issues off the table for the European powers themselves. All right, so the existence of the European Union is a third aspect, the sort of postmodern world of the contemporary international environment. I think if you look at Europe, one thing that's cool also is that Europe, compared to the United States, spends not that much on defense, 1% to 2% compared to 3% or 4% for the U.S. You can argue that this is a result of free riding on American security expenditures or the result of different values between the U.S. and Europe, Mars versus Venus, or reflects Europe's own post-war experience and what they think works in the international environment, which is basically values and institutions matter more than power. You could argue about what the causes are, but the kind of structural fact is there that Europe, in terms of population and economic size, is comparable to the United States. In terms of its military expenditures, spends much less than the U.S. And I think with regard to domestic European politics now, especially European demographics, it's very hard to imagine that you would get significant increases in European military expenditures. I think in terms of the domestic political situation in the major European countries, that would be extremely challenging. All right, obviously you have the rise of new powers, the BRICS, including Brazil and Russia, but I think mainly China and India. Chinese GDP is now 23% of US GDP in 2007. Okay, at some point in the future, China will probably catch and surpass the United States. It's not clear exactly when that will happen. I think what you can say is that a Chinese challenge to American hegemony is a ways out there, a couple of decades, but maybe much more than a couple of decades. I have a very, I have to say, reserved, possibly cynical view about Russia in terms of the role that it will play in the world. It seems to me that you're looking at what's made Russia kind of palpable as a player on the international scene now is energy and oil money. If that goes away, Russia will be in a much diminished situation. I would say the one thing we should look at in Russia is the point at which Russian life expectancy begins to increase as opposed to declining. When that happens, I think we could look and say, well, maybe something really significant has happened in Russia that hasn't happened up to now. And Japan, I think, is a country that finds itself now in a very uncertain position, clearly extremely anxious about China. and worried about also its own demographic future. There was a story, I guess about a year ago in the New York Times in which, I think the reproduction rate in Japan is something like 1.3 or 1.39, although there's some evidence that it might increase. But they were asking a Japanese intellectual about, what's going to happen with Japan? The country is shrinking in size in terms of its population. And he said something, I can't imagine an American saying this. He said, well, we had a good ride, and if we die out, that's it. But that's kind of a very Japanese attitude, not something you'd find the Americans saying. All right, so you do have these, if you look at the structural situation, you do have, the hegemony of the United States, the presence of Europe, rising powers, and you then have, I think, also, and certainly, if you look at these attributes, some of them, like American hegemony in the European Union, really are new things. The kind of changing distribution of power in the international system is an old thing. It's what's always happened in the international environment. You do have, though, also, I think, as an attribute of the contemporary system, the presence of a significant number of failed and weak states. Estimated in different studies, the numbers go from 37 to 73 if you look at some of the studies that have been done, in which you have a situation in which you're looking at, and clearly the fact that you've had bad governance, very weak governance in a number of these states is problematic for people that are living, most problematic for people that are living in these countries. It also generates global bads, not just global goods, so transnational crime, disease, and the thing that's been pointed to most historically, transnational terrorism. All right, transnational terrorism in and of itself is also not a new thing. The Irish Republican Army organizing against Britain in the 19th century, organized in Weehawken, New Jersey. And then these guys went back, maybe it was Hoboken. And then these guys went back to Ireland. The anarchist movement around the turn of the 20th century assassinated, I think it was 7 heads of state, including the President of the United States. So transnational terrorism is not a new thing. And we also have to say that transnational terrorism clearly has multiple causes. So I'm not making a claim that if you looked at failed and weak states, that's the full explanation for transnational terrorism. There are clearly other factors that are associated with it, and it's also the case that we have no consensus now on what the actual causal mechanism or mechanisms are. So you can point to is radical Islamic ideology. So somehow if we got Saudi Arabia to stop kind of sending people money and building mosques, would transnational terrorism go away? There are arguments which argue that radical Islam is the result of the failure of the Islamic world to meet the challenge of modernization in the West, a basically traditional society which wasn't able to deal with the Western world once you had the Industrial Revolution, contra certainly initially Japan, but then Korea and China in East Asia. The argument that was made by the Bush administration, political repression in the Arab world, which gave no political outlet for people, and one of the things that happened as a result of that was terrorist activities. Alienation of Muslim immigrants in Europe. It's a very different argument about what the causes of transnational terrorism are. And then also failed states and the fact that they can offer sanctuary and safety, so Afghanistan, the border areas of Pakistan. I don't want to make an argument about which of these is actually the right answer, and maybe they're all right in some ways. I only want to say that, at least to some extent, our security issues are tied up with these issues of sanctuary and failed states, and it clearly has been advantageous for al-Qaeda to have basically safe havens where they could train people. And a lot of the major plots, both obviously 9/11, but also this plot that was just prosecuted in England, were people who were actually trained in Pakistan or Afghanistan. All right, so you have transnational terrorism. We don't have our arms around exactly what the causes are, but it's clearly there. It poses, I would say, an unknown and unknowable threat in terms of what the actual threat is. I had a conversation that stayed with me very vividly in 2003 with Christoph Bertram, who was then he was the head of the big German Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, which is a big German kind of foreign policy think tank. And he said, the trouble with you Americans is you're using a worst case analysis here. I sort of thought about that. I thought about it for a year, and I said, I couldn't see exactly what else we should be doing. And I actually bumped into him a year later, and I asked him about this. He, of course, had no memory of having said this, but it had sort of filled my head for a year. But I think the problem is you're dealing with a situation in which you have this small probability of something really bad happening. We have no way of assigning a kind of expected utility to this. If you set off dirty nuclear bombs in a number of major cities around the world, it would be incredibly bad. But what's the chances of that happening? I mean, we have no way of getting something that looks like a real probability estimate. And we have to say here, look, very surprising, incredibly unpredicted things have happened in the world. The communists coming to power in Russia after the First World War. I mean, if you'd asked people in 1915, I don't know how many people you would have found that could have predicted that. Hitler coming to power in Nazi Germany. If you'd asked people in, Germany in the mid-1920s at least, whether you would have had this, I have to say, quite crazed guy coming to power in one of the most advanced countries in Europe, people would have said, wouldn't have been quite in the realm of possibility. So, very bizarre things have happened before, and 9/11 may not be the most bizarre thing that we've seen. And I do think I've asked myself a bit, and I've had some conversations with people about why terrorism is so bad, because one thing that people will say is, look, all right, let's say you get another 9/11, so it's true. I mean, you killed quite a large number of people, but it's a lot fewer people that are killed in automobile accidents in a year, for instance, in the United States. So maybe you just want to, you could ask, and here I'm bloviating a little bit because I don't want to say I have empirical evidence for this, but you could say that why worry about this so much? I mean, let's say they have some terrorist events. Let's say that several hundred people are killed. We live with risk all the time in our lives. So why are we so worried about this? And I would say at least one explanation is that for a lot of the other risks that we live with, like driving, you kind of know what they are, and you can take actions to deal with them. You're worried, if you lived in New York City in the 1980s or 1970s and you're worried about crime, so you could decide that you weren't going to go out at night or you weren't going to go into certain neighborhoods. I think that the problem with terrorism, and now, 9/11 has now drifted far away from us in terms of time, or a bit away from us, but I think that one of the problems is that it's a kind of pervasive fear that you can't actually prevent, that you don't know what you could do to protect yourself, and I think it makes it more pervasive than simply the number of people that could be killed. All right, so it's their unknown and unknowable threat, but I think what has happened, if you look at transnational terrorism, some weak or badly governed states, and weapons of mass destruction, that you do have another development which is historically unprecedented globally, which is you've broken the relationship between the ability to do harm and the underlying kind of structural capacity of actors. So if you look at North Korea, so here's a country that does have missiles, does have nuclear weapons. Its GDP is about 0.002 of the United States, so way less than 1%. Way less than 1% the GDP of Japan, less, maybe 1.5% the GDP of China, maybe 4% the GDP of South Korea. Despite that, North Korea could be in a position where it could kill millions of people in Japan, Russia, and China. That is historically unprecedented. It's like imagining that Liechtenstein would have posed a mortal threat to Germany in 1914. That isn't something that's happened before. So you're in this situation in which you have the possibility of relatively weak actors being in a position to actually wreak substantial damage on much more powerful actors. I do think if you did have a major transnational incident, something on the order of 9/11 or bigger, or a number of these, there is a real possibility for changing the international rules of the game in ways that would be very uncomfortable. I think if you ask, let's say you had an attack on the United States, which let's say kills 10,000. And there's some pretty good evidence that it originated in the border areas of Pakistan. I do not think you would be having the kind of discussions the United States is having now about whether or not we should actually engage in military activity in these border areas. I think it would happen. If you looked at the situation and you said, gee, Saudi Arabia has been funding a lot of the kind of ideology which has supported al-Qaeda, if you reach that conclusion, which may or may not be true, I'm not making that claim even, but if you reach that conclusion, it's not so evident that you would continue to have a system in which you'd be transferring billions of dollars to countries that have very radical perspectives. And you might have a way of thinking about oil, for instance, in which you'd say, maybe we should think about oil exports as part of the global heritage of mankind. With the revenue going to the World Bank to be distributed to developing countries. I think developments like this, which I think are, kind of unimaginable now, but are potentially imaginable after a major attack, would be very, very bad outcomes. This would be a much more violent, much less comfortable world than the world in which we're living in now. And as I have to say, used to say in my lectures, in 2003, kind of shortly after 9/11, that, that is, if you were an undergraduate now, had a much better chance of dying from a nuclear bomb than I had, having grown up through the Cold War, and that looks more remote now. But I think if you really did have a major nuclear attack, you would just have a much more uncomfortable world. So there are clearly ways to think about, there are reasons to think that we need to find a way of dealing with this nexus of problems that exists in the contemporary international environment. Okay, so that's where if you're thinking about contending grand strategies, let me offer a few of them. One is retrenchment. This is actually an argument which Posen, who teaches at MIT, offered, which basically says the United States should limit its alliance commitments, scale back NATO, limit NATO to Europe and the U.S.-Japanese alliance, be very, very resistant to using force, limit expectations about anything you could accomplish if you're thinking about intervening in third world countries, and assume, I think the tacit assumption here is that transnational terrorism and WMD is a manageable threat. I am let me tell you why I think this is a wrong strategy and why it wouldn't work. I think the U.S. still plays in Asia an extremely valuable security role. If the United States were to withdraw from Asia, I think you would have a nuclear-armed South Korea and Japan. The Japanese are clearly extremely anxious about the rise of China, and I think somewhat mollified by the fact that the United States is still very present. If you withdrew American presence, I think it would look like a much messier environment. If you think about American withdrawal from the Middle East, and I'm not thinking about Iraq now, but just thinking about the Arabian Peninsula, the Saudis, the Gulf states, major sources of oil, clearly worried about Iran, feeling anxious, but also, I think you could say, certainly bolstered by the fact that they think they have American engagement to protect them against the worst possible outcomes. If the United States withdrew from that area of the world, retrenched in a major way, I think you'd either see the Saudis and the Gulf states throwing in their lot with Iran or trying to develop a much more robust military capacity than they have now. That would also not be a very comfortable outcome. So I don't see this policy of retrenchment as something that would actually further in a significant way American interests. All right, second kind of candidate, the Bush Doctrine. All right, I thought Charles Gibson's question to Palin about what's the Bush Doctrine, in which I have to say, if someone had asked me that, I would never have said preemptive and preventive war. And I've worked for the Bush administration for 3.5 years, so I want to think I have some claim to expertise here or knowledge. So I would have said root causes in democratization. But let's say if you look at the Bush Doctrine, it had these elements. So it has this notion of preemptive preventive war, that is, we have to strike first before really bad things happen to us. Root causes in democratization, that is, that the fundamental cause of transnational terrorism is political repression in the Islamic world. In the line, and this is an argument that Rice repeated in her very recent Foreign Affairs article, in which she argued that, the problem is that the bet that we made in the Islamic world was that we would get security from stability, and in fact, we haven't gotten either stability or security. The necessity of American primacy and unilateralism is needed. And I do think, in the administration, I think it's not that it's not reported, but it doesn't come across as clearly. The idea of democratization as the animating focus of the Bush administration is, I think, fundamentally and basically what the administration was interested in. Okay, so the question is, how well do different elements of this work? All right, what we can see with clarity now, if you're thinking about the Bush Doctrine, is, okay, democratic regime change is hard. It's clearly much harder than the administration thought it would be. I think there's a more generic problem, which is changing domestic authority structures in other states is very hard. Democratic regimes in the Middle East would clearly not necessarily be more pro-American. There have been these polls which say, if you ran an election now in Saudi Arabia, a free and fair election, that bin Laden would probably do very well if you were electing someone for president. The United States has clearly relied in the past and is going to continue to rely on autocratic regimes in the Middle East and Central Asia to further its strategic and material interests. So Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan. So, the doctrine in my view, is an element of intellectual incoherence. Put the United States in a position where we're pushing democratization very, very strongly, and we're closely allied with Saudi Arabia. Now, we did tell some stories about that, which is like women's rights have expanded somewhat, and there were some local elections, but it's not a story which looks very persuasive. And if you're thinking about a grand strategy, that's not the position that you want to be in. All right, let me offer. This is a tragedy of technology. So I sort of revised this presentation marginally when I was sitting at Philadelphia Airport last night, wondering, because I was scared by people here, whether I was actually going to get a plane to Ithaca. So I want to add one more grand strategy before I come to mine, the one that I'm going to advocate, which is multilateral engagement. This is something you've certainly seen from many, Eikenberry, the Princeton Project, Anne-Marie Slaughter. Basically, it's an argument that you have to work through multilateral organizations. You have to use persuasion and attraction rather than coercion, and power is a way of getting what you want. And you need to have self-constraint on America's freedom of action. All right, I would say, certainly to some extent, this is maybe the most prevalent alternative to the Bush doctrine, as I've described it, and as Charlie Gibson understood it. I think the problems are this. I think inescapably in the contemporary environment, American power will breed suspicion. So people are not going to be comfortable with the United States. Other powers will inescapably free ride on American power. So if you look at Afghanistan, okay, everybody admits Afghanistan is a problem. We need to think about it. We need to do something about it. If you look at Afghanistan, look at the European commitments, look at the caveats, that is the limitations which European powers have put on the use of their force, you do see a situation in which free riding is inescapable. I do think other major powers have different values from the United States. So the European vision of how to operate and interact and engage the world is very different than the American one, or at least different. And finally, it will be hard for the United States to limit its own freedom of action, which is something it will have to do if you want to buy into this multilateral strategy, because otherwise other countries aren't going to trust us. And finally, and you can see this, in the way in which transnational terrorism and how we should respond to it has been formulated, the Europeans, have been very essentially bought into the idea that this is something which needs to be treated as a criminal problem. And the United States went very quickly to the idea that this was a war on terrorism. Well, this is a very different view about what the nature of the problem is, and it's not going to be easy to resolve these. And I think given the uncertainty of the environment which we're looking at, multilateral engagement, it sounds okay. I don't think it's something that's really going to work out as a coherent and consistent strategy for the United States. Okay, so I'm going to offer my candidate here, which is that what the United States ought to be doing is saying that we want to create a world of responsible sovereigns, by which I mean a set of states that could essentially govern effectively within their own boundaries and that would play by the existing international rules of the game. Doesn't mean they would have to buy into these rules, but if they wanted to change the rules, they would do it according to the rules that are out there now. It would be normalization and not democratization. So you wouldn't, especially political democratization. The kind of model here is Libya and not Gaza. So what we've done with Libya is exactly what responsible sovereignty, although it's not that you could argue that Libya is a fully responsible sovereign state now, but it's what we would try to have countries become. So you want countries that could govern effectively within their own borders, that could provide services to their own population, that could promote economic growth, that would respect basic human rights, sort of minimum human rights. And you'd want them to be able to accept and work effectively with existing international regimes. All right, I'm going to give a little defense of why I think this would work. I do think that this is a a strategy which would secure international support. I mean, what's happened over the last 5 years has kind of made democracy a very problematic word in the international environment. I think responsible sovereignty, or maybe good governance, sovereignty may have too many syllables in it to actually work as an articulated grand strategy, is, though, something that would get general support. Everybody would say they're in favor of it. It doesn't mean everybody would necessarily act according to it, but it would mean everyone would be in favor of it. I do think it's a policy, although it would take some selling, that could secure domestic political support in the United States, although you'd have to say that this is something that's associated with basic human rights and that democracy could certainly be part of responsible sovereignty, although it's not necessarily all of it. And the language is something, and let me read you a couple of quotes here. Our hopes, our hearts, our hands are with those on every continent who are building democracy and freedom. Their cause is America's cause. That's one quote. The second quote is, the survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world. All right, the first was Clinton's first inaugural address, and the second was Bush's second inaugural address. So there isn't so much space there between the way Americans think about this. So I do think it's something that could generate some support. There are exceptions. I mean, I think it's not going to be so easy to get China to buy into this in terms of Chinese material interests. If you look at whether political rulers in developed states would buy into this policy in terms of what they did and not just in terms of the rhetorical articulation, the answer is not necessarily. That in many cases, having bad governance is better for them than having good governance because it gives them more opportunities for rent extraction. So it's certainly not the case that this would necessarily be easy, but I do think it has at least a possibility for getting generic support both internationally and domestically. All right, so here's what this would mean if you're thinking about this policy in terms of what we should actually do as a matter of policy guidance. I would say first that you should promote freedom in all of its dimensions. So this could be economic freedom, political freedom, basic human rights, cultural freedom, religious freedom. I think that's something which would give us a much wider range of policy steps that we could take that would actually be consistent with what we'd articulated as our grand strategy. And it wouldn't put us in this position of saying that we're basically in favor of democracy at the same time that we're closely allied with Saudi Arabia. All right, so that's one thing that it would imply. Secondly, it does imply that we need programs that offer incentives. I think one thing we know, and it may be the only thing we know about how we might influence domestic authority structures in other states, is that incentives do work. So the big incentive program was clearly membership in the European Union for Central European states. But a couple of things that we could do is broaden, if one of the things that the U.S. did that Nick referred to was the Millennium Challenge Account. And this is a foreign aid program that's entirely incentive-based. So the U.S. increases its foreign aid if countries have demonstrated that they've already produced better governance. We ought to have trade agreements and more open trade arrangements. So the single most important thing that Europe and the United States could do for development would be to get rid of its agricultural trade barriers, which, of course, we have not done up to now. I think we need to increase so the kind of increasing incentives is something that I'm pretty confident about. I think we need to increase options for multilateral cooperation. So if you're thinking about responsible sovereignty, this is not something that the U.S. can do by itself, but it's also not something that you're going to be able to do through, say, the United Nations alone. There's too much disagreement, obviously, on the Security Council to do that. So what you need are a number of different modalities. They may be the UN, they may be the Security Council, they may be regional organizations, it may be NATO, which I think is very valuable as an out-of-area military force. It may be doing things like more routinized coalitions of the willing. The United States, over the last several years, has promoted something called a Proliferation Security Initiative, which it now has, I'm forgetting the exact number of states, but I think it's about 80, which is an arrangement where countries agree to try to prevent the sale and transportation of weapons of mass destruction. So it requires some coordination among countries in terms of they've actually done a number of they've intercepted ships on the high sea, and it's worked pretty well. It's not highly institutionalized, but it's not entirely ad hoc either. So those, in terms of international policies, I think are what the United States, if you want to think about responsible sovereignty as a grand strategy, would have to do. I think within the United States there are also a lot of things that the United States would have to do to make the strategy work or give it a chance of working, and these will be very hard. It's obvious, everyone in Washington knows this and says it, that we need a better mix of civilian and military capacity. The budget of USAID and the State Department is $40 billion. The security budget of the United States, that is DOD plus DOE, Department of Energy expenditures on nuclear weapons, is about $800 billion. So a ratio of 20 to 1. Whereas basically, kind of doctrine would say now, if you're thinking about state building and post-conflict reconstruction, the ratio ought to be the other way around. It ought to be more like 20 to 1 for civilian as opposed to military. You need to reorganize the U.S. government to enhance its state building capacity and its ability to actually promote responsible sovereignty, and that will be very hard. You might, and there have been a number of different proposals, you might want to make AID a cabinet level agency. You might want to integrate it even more closely with the State Department. You might want to increase the size of the State Department. You clearly would want to increase civilian-military coordination, or you may end up saying, you know, civilian agencies in the U.S. government don't know how to do this, so we should just give it to the military and forget about it, and expand the scope of activity that the U.S. military is engaged in. So you'd have to at least begin to tackle some of these problems if you wanted to make responsible sovereignty an effective grand strategy. All right, let me close by saying what I think is the reason I titled this lecture, "Can the United States have a grand strategy?" And my answer, I think, here is maybe. And the maybe is because I think that we're confronted with a huge challenge that we don't know how to deal with, which is how do we get better governance, economic growth, ultimately, I mean, one would hope full-fledged liberal democracy in parts of the world which don't have it now. You know, if we actually had a world of responsible sovereigns, it would be a much nicer world to live in, not just for Americans, but for everybody else in the world that we're living in now. We don't know how to do that, and we don't know how it's happened in places which are already well developed. You know, we have a number of different theories out there in social science about how this works. You know, I have to say that if I had to bet on a position right now, I would say that a lot of what's happened is path dependent and haphazard. That rather than being the result of structural conditions, I mean, the United States caught a bunch of lucky breaks when it was founded, and it worked out really well. So that it's hard to think about doing this from the outside because political development and economic development are so much hostage and contingent on basically indigenous factors which we're not able to predict and which sometimes we don't have a good grasp of. So that's a big problem. Second problem, which I alluded to earlier, is that political leaders in weak and failed states, you know, often prefer rent-seeking to responsible sovereignty. They don't want rule of law. They want rule of unlaw because it gives them the opportunity to extract resources more effectively than they could otherwise. And thirdly, if you look at the situation, and I think this is a kind of deep structural problem if we look at the contemporary environment, you did have, at least if you're looking at the industrial West, including Japan, a set of developments which were more or less autochthonous, that is, generated by factors within these countries. If you look at the developing world now, I mean, I would say especially Africa, you have a situation in which these countries are expected to perform have a very wide range of responsibilities. Education, social security, defense, healthcare, which have really been generated not by debates within these societies, but by mimicking the set of institutional structures that exist in the West. And that is a problem which Europe and the United States actually never confronted. So there are really, I think, some deep structural problems here in terms of how you actually can get responsible sovereignty. But if we're looking at some kind of guidance and some kind of path, I think we're in the environment that we're in now, we're not going to find some grand strategy which is as neat as containment. And we're not going to find that grand strategy because the problem that we're dealing with is harder than anything we had to deal with in the Cold War. But I think that responsible sovereignty is kind of the best shot that we could take at making something work. And it's better, I think, than the kind of thing, the other alternative candidates now, retrenchment, or what the administration put forth, or engage multilateralism that are out there now as contenders. So we've got a few minutes. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Have you read a speech entitled Beyond Vietnam?
No.
I think that might be why we're in Iraq the way we are and poised for this confusion. And it's just a theory I have. I think if someone had taken that speech to heart in the 60s, 70s, and I guess another question would be, in your Washington experience in different departments, has anyone ever suggested strongly or even required that that whole department read anything outside the realm, like anything, ever? See, I think that's part of the problem in Washington and higher academia. And Cornell's dealing with this communication between the departments, but none of my teachers in high school ever suggested I read that speech.
Okay, I don't know the speech, but let me say in general, I actually think compared to other governments, the American government is actually pretty open. You know, partly because you've got all these think tanks in Washington, which is something you don't have in any other country equivalent. You also have all these political appointees. I mean, some of whom know a lot, others of whom don't necessarily know a lot. So it is the case in the US government that there are a lot of ideas going in and out.
Right.
More, I think, than is the case than any other major country. But it's also the case, as I said, I think these are really hard problems, not obvious what the answer is.
Yeah.
So it's hard, you know, even if there's some great answer out there, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will find it.
Well, there was a man that moved beyond politics and beyond partisanship, and his name is Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote that speech, and I didn't hear it on the radio till 4 years ago. And when I heard it, and no one has had any kind of similar reaction in my age group or not, but they sort of, what? You know, but King actually solved this problem that you've been talking about, because, you know, he went to the mountain, you know, and but since we didn't read the speech.
Right. It always makes me nervous when someone begins with a "have you read" question, because I know my answer is generally going to be no, I haven't. But
I'd like to know if you want to talk about this responsible sovereignty in the force competition in the U.S. What did you think to build the mobilization, to mobilize support in the population? What is a critical mass that we need of responsible individuals? And I'd like you to tell me what would that be and how much where are we standing on that?
yeah, I mean, if you thought about it in the United States to build support for this, okay, let me say a couple of things. One is I know.
About to have an election now.
Yeah. I mean, people are, this is an idea that's kind of bounced around, you know, and it's a couple of my colleagues, Steve Stedman, they're about to come out with a book where this is a central theme. Here's, I think, the problem, and it's one of the things that makes me nervous about this. It's way too wonky a phrase to be useful if you're thinking about something that would, you know, is Obama or McCain going to stand up and say we need responsible sovereignty? Who the heck? If you have to spend 3 minutes explaining it, it's not going to work. So I don't think I have the right label. That's the first thing I have to say. And I don't exactly know what the right label is either, but then again, that's why we pay politicians these big bucks or whatever we pay them. So I think the problem for generating support in the United States is that you can generate support in the U.S. for democracy. Americans believe in that. You know, they may see now that it's hard, they may be fed up, but it's something that really has resonance with the American public. And the question now, maybe the language has to be, you know, build individual freedom or individual opportunity, which could go along with this. which wouldn't necessarily say that you're going to go down some kind of narrow democracy path. But I think selling it wouldn't, well, I think you could do it. I know that this label is not the right label to do it, and I can see, I mean, thinking about this as a political project, that you need a better label than responsible sovereignty. And I don't know what it is. But I think the idea could work, Marty? Wait, let me just get this, sorry.
If one takes Libya as the example of a successful instance of responsible sovereignty, wasn't that achieved by Charlie Gibson's account of the Bush doctrine, namely preemptive?
Okay, I would say, right, okay, I would say partly, right? But we also, yeah, I mean, the fact that Reagan, launched a strike against Libya, clearly made Gaddafi think a little bit, I think. But we also had to have this, long set of negotiations about what kind of deal we would make. And you have to have Reich showing up and saying, we're going to reward you for doing this. Now, I have to say, in the case of Libya, it's only partially a success because, I think if you look domestically, this is not a, I have to look at the data for Libya. It's not a country that's working that well for its own population. But at least it's what you have to, yeah, it's able to do that. But I think for responsible sovereignty, you'd want reasonable provision of services to the population. So I want to say it's something more than just being able to control its own territory. I think the Libyans are doing that. But it's a way of thinking about it which doesn't get you in this bind of saying we're only going to deal with people that are Democrats, which clearly we're not only going to be able to do. But yeah, I agree that force did play a role, but not the only one.
It seems like that the Middle East is definitely, a big part of our international relations, and we are fighting two wars there. And you have alluded to earlier that, the Bush doctrine, the idea that, political instability is a root cause of, why democracy hasn't held up there. It seems like to the issue. What do you think, especially in the Middle East, is the cause of why democracy hasn't flourished? Do you think it's religious, cultural, just disaffection with the East, Islam versus the West?
Okay, I have no good idea here. I can give you an answer, but I don't, I don't know better than, I have no answer that's sort of better than, what you might come up with. Oil I think is part of it. It's clearly very, it's very difficult to manage. If you're Norway, you can manage oil revenues, okay, or maybe Alaska. But it's very hard to manage oil revenues when you've got, basically an undeveloped institutional structure and there's, huge advantage, although Abu Dhabi has actually done very well, at least for its own population. So it's not that none of these countries have done this effectively. But I don't have a kind of...
But still there, democracy, it's not democratic.
No, it's not democratic.
So why hasn't democracy found that area of the region, even though you have economic wealth? But it has, I feel like, in every part of the world, it has found a root.
I don't have, if you ask me again, I don't have an answer. It's too easy to say I'm not a Middle East expert. So, you have a whole set of candidate arguments. Islam is kind of a theocratic religion, and therefore it's more difficult for this to happen. But of course you do have, if you look at other, Malaysia, Indonesia, you do have democratic developments in Islamic countries. Period of colonialism, in which you basically had, first monarchical and then military rule. So I don't have a good answer to this. It's clearly not a problem. It is, the extent to which you haven't had democracy taking root in the Middle East is unique, actually. So it's not, it's more the case than for any other area of the world. And I don't have a good answer. Nor do I have even more important, is there some systematic path that could lead to more democratic openness? And, my reaction here is, if these things are path-dependent and idiosyncratic, what you need is an opportunistic strategy. Not one, if it looks like Saudi Arabia is willing to expand, rights for women, do it. There was a very, this was, I think, a New York Times story about the Saudi government developing a new university. And they were doing this, they actually gave it to Aramco to develop.
Is it Calist?
No, it's this thing with Cornell. No, it's something else, I think. But in the description of this, it was a description of Dhahran, where Aramco is located. So this is mostly, almost entirely Saudi. Women drive, people, they don't have burqas. It kind of operates as, a kind of Western model within this country that you think of as being incredibly conservative, which is the general American image. So there I would say, okay, there are clearly elements within Saudi Arabia that are significant, that are looking towards modernization as a strategy, not necessarily democratization. Buy in with them, support them if you can. But so I'm just evading your question because I don't know what the answer is. Let me just say that.
When you were discussing responsible sovereigns, you stated that one of the keys to a responsible sovereign was playing by the existing rules of the game. My question is, how can we get other nations to become responsible sovereigns when the U.S. itself often sidesteps international treaties and international law, for example, with the Geneva Convention, especially since the United States is the superpower right now in the world?
Yeah, I don't know how it's... One is, it's not, clearly there was a huge debate about, the extent to which the Geneva Conventions applied. And I would say, if you look, kind of my text here is Jack Goldsmith's book, The Terror Presidency. He was the counsel at the Justice Department who reversed the torture memos. His argument is that what's striking about the U.S. is the extent to which it actually is bound by law, at least, national law, including international law that the U.S. has signed on to. So, the question was, if you're looking at, did the Geneva Conventions apply? And the argument, that a number of lawyers have made was that the United States was not formally obligated to apply the Geneva Conventions, although it would have been smart if we had applied Article 3 rights to these prisoners because it would have been instrumentally a smarter thing to do. So I don't think it's a case that you can look at the U.S. and say that the United States simply ignores international law. I think it's much more the case that, let me give you one other example. If you look at human rights conventions, there are about 25 of them. There's a very interesting study by a lawyer, Una Hathaway, looking at the relationship between signing human rights conventions and actual human rights practices, and the correlation is zero. The U.S., for a long period of time, at least through 1988, had only signed a relatively small number of these conventions, I think 6 out of 24. And the reason, I think, is when the U.S. actually signs up to international agreements, you have a rule of law system that actually makes them work. So I think, although the general perception is that the U.S. has ignored international law, I think that's actually inaccurate, including, how you should have dealt with the Geneva Conventions and Guantanamo.
One of the points you made was normalization, not democratization. How are you going to find normalization when I think some parts of the world wouldn't want to take the Western model? They'd want to, put in some Asian parts and other things. Yeah. Can the U.S. do that?
Yeah, so here's what I would say. When I'm thinking about normalization, what I'm thinking is, okay, on the international level, either abide by the present rules or change the rules according to the existing rules. But then I'm thinking, look, what you want is what's the kind of minimum level of things that, that you would expect? So you would expect the state to provide basic security, decent rule of law, something that populations want. Some level of basic provision of services, although that's going to depend on what level of resources these societies have. So basic education and provision of health care. So it's and respect for kind of basic human rights. So I think you could, even in, regardless of the environment, whether you think about an Asian environment, African or what have you, or Middle East environment, those are things I think that you could get some significant amount of buy-in for. And that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about normalization. Now, many people would argue that, if you can get to that point, in fact, you will put yourself on this escalator that's going to take you to, kind of modern liberal democracy. But and that may or may not be true, but even if it's not true, it would certainly leave us in a much better situation than the situation we're in now in many parts of the world. Literacy rates in Pakistan are like 40% or something. Not good. Just see, here.
Well, just now you mentioned to be a responsible sovereignty, that should generally conform with the interests of powerful states. And you also mentioned maybe China is a possible exception. So I was wondering, what do you mean by this? Do you mean China is not a responsible sovereignty? Well, America should not conform with the interests of China since it is pursuing material interests. Would you please elaborate upon something?
Yeah, so what I'm thinking about in the Chinese case is this, and there's been some small change in Chinese policy. So, this is explicitly tied up with Chinese concern about access to raw materials. So you've certainly had, over the course of the last decade, China buying into a lot of very problematic countries. So Sudan, Chad. In the Chad case, with when they developed oil in Chad in the late 1990s, the World Bank was actually involved in, I thought, a very imaginative effort to kind of get the oil revenues and use these revenues for social services in Chad. What's happened now, actually this was just last week, the Chadian government has abrogated the agreement. One of the reasons that happened was they developed additional oil resources, using Chinese revenues, and the Chadian government doesn't need the World Bank lending which it needed in the past. So when I'm thinking about the exception for China and promoting responsible sovereignty, I am thinking explicitly about this good governance issue, especially with regard to raw materials.
You suggest that one of the difficulties is that political leaders in weak and failed states often prefer bad governance, but the U.S. also relies on this bad governance in many instances. So how can we overcome that?
What are you thinking about it when you're thinking about?
I'm thinking about Yemen.
Yes, so the problem here is, we've got these not so good guys. We're thinking about security relations with them. And here's why I think, this is, I think what I'm suggesting here is a grand strategy makes sense, and I can suggest some things that it means for policy implications. I see that it's not neat, for exactly reasons like this. So we need these guys. So what it would mean in Yemen is, okay, we need these guys on security issues. It's not a great government. Could we look in Yemen for, and this is a problem, it's not systematic, look opportunistically for things we might do that might improve governance in Yemen or open scope of freedom which isn't there now. And knowing what to do, would require knowing more about Yemen than I know. But I think this is why, it's not just why I can't defend this kind of responsible sovereignty as saying, I have found the holy grail of grand strategy for the United States. But it's why, there isn't one now and why no one's come up with one, because everybody sees that this kind of, package of failed weakly governed states, WMD, transnational terrorism, they're not all linked together, but they're related, is a big problem, and you kind of see that bad governance is certainly a big problem for people that are living in these badly governed countries. But we don't have a formula for dealing with it. So, there are going to be a lot of places where it's going to be quite hard. And I don't have a kind of Yemen story which is like the Saudi story, even if the Saudi story is based on a newspaper article, so I don't know if it would actually work as real policy.
Question regarding your ratio of the money allotted to the Department of Defense and the money for civilian aspects. And so you're saying basically we should emphasis on state building and to deal with all those failing states. But the recent event with Russia and the growth of China and India perhaps could suggest that given the scarce resources that every country has, in particular the United States, maybe you should focus today on the big countries and the big powers for perhaps the power politics that may in the next few decades or years, instead of focusing on perhaps the 1990s and 2000, early 2000 problem of failing states and not deal with them.
Okay, that's right. I'm making, this is a good question. So I'm making a claim that this failed state problem is going to continue. And I have to admit that part of the reason you make that claim is tied up with this sense that it will be related to our security. It's easier to make that argument in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the border areas. Okay, if that disappeared, so maybe we wouldn't care. If you look at Zimbabwe, the fact is we don't really care, even though this is a huge human tragedy. On the other hand, I do think the problem is going to stay around, and I do think it would be, if we could actually find a way to make these states function more effectively, that would be a good thing. So that's the part that's so I don't think this is just going to be a 2008 problem, but maybe you should say I hope that I'm wrong. On the other side, if you look at the military side, I can see that, if you look at military conflict, it's not, it's very hard for me to play out a sort of scenario with Russia. It's not hard to play out scenarios with China. It's true that that's kind of, scary. It's not to say that it's going to happen, but you could anyone in this room could tell a story, throw in Taiwan, unrest within China itself, or just mistakes where this could happen. This would be one incredibly bad thing. But then you're just saying, you need to think about what the balance needs to be. So I'm not saying split it 50-50, which I don't think we'd have any chance of doing. And it's true, it's something that's also hard about implementing this policy is I don't know if you gave, the state, if you double the budget of the State Department and AID, whether they'd have any idea what to do with it effectively. So it isn't that it's easy, but I do think we have to think about some way of reallocating resources. And people clearly will be doing this. I mean, I think you will see some change over the next several years.